side, and so I want to note that for the record. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair and members, Anya Lawler on behalf of the Western Center on Law and Poverty. For many of the reasons previously stated, but particularly because of the significant loss of funding for affordable housing, we remain opposed to the proposal. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, members, Marlene Murphy from the City of Fresno. We remain opposed to the bill. It narrows the definition of loans, which has a significant adverse impact to Fresno. We, Fresno, had repayment agreements documented by promissory notes with terms, normal loan terms, but because in some cases the accounting records from 20 years ago were, as permitted by law, not retained, we can't show that that actual cash passed to us, so the loan is denied. And in some cases, the city paid the obligation directly to the third party on behalf of the agency, so those loans are denied. The loans were determined to be for redevelopment purposes by our oversight board, so that decision does not have to be made by DOF. It was made by our oversight board. And we, the redevelopment agency, have had those loans recognized in each of the last 20-plus years through our statement of indebtedness. Just because cash didn't pass to us doesn't mean that it wasn't a loan. If I buy a house, I don't receive the cash. The seller receives the cash, but I still have the loan, don't I? Yes. On the LAIF rate, it undoes the court's ruling regarding the rate and will reduce payment to Fresno by about $41 million, $8 million for housing. It was said here earlier today, I think, that the LAIF rate, that loan rates between city and agencies have sometimes been too high. But 1484 doesn't rely on those early loan rates. 1484 sets the loan rate between agencies and cities as the whatever the LAIF rate was at the time the loan was made, adjusted quarterly. So it does not rely on whatever rates were between the city and agency in the past. And lastly, the bill undermines due process. We urge you to reject this bill. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, Senator, and members of the committee. Martin Scheel, the mayor of City of Lakeport, and the City of Lakeport is here to support our fellow cities that are in opposition of this bill that is presented today with the May 14th language. We would further echo the comments, concerns, and recommendations of our fellow opposing cities, the California League of Cities, and I would urge you respectfully to not support this bill, and thank you so much for the time.
Thank you, sir. Anyone else? Well, let me just say this. It seems to me that as to the interest rate issue, that the matter is going to be decided in the appeal of the Glendale versus Department of Finance case, unless there's another one floating out there. So I don't know how Finance wants to handle that. It also occurs to me that as to the issue of reimbursement agreements versus loans, while I have not read the City of Watsonville case, there seems to be some significant issue here that needs to be further addressed. I do appreciate Finance's work on this matter, but I would certainly think that we need to really drill down a little further and take a look at what really is a loan that customary people would agree and consider to be a loan, where repayment would be required, and certainly fundamental fairness would dictate that repayment be required. And then it seems to me we have this issue having to do with the countywide oversight boards. I could ask Finance before we get to questions by Senator Pan. What would be the problem with allowing local oversight boards to continue to manage this process, since that seems to be a bone of contention, however perhaps more minor than some of these other ones?
During the previous discussion on this bill here, the one of the phrases that was put out there was putting a period on this process, and transitioning to the countywide oversight board puts a period on this process, because if we're to maintain 385 individual oversight boards, it's unnecessary. Because under the administration's proposal that's enacted, we're going to go ahead and move to an annual ROPS process, and we're going to get people onto the last and final ROPS process track, where they're not going to have to submit a ROPS anymore. They submit one ROPS and they're done. And then most of their property is going to be disposed of as well. So there will really be no need to have 385 individual oversight boards and drawing on the time of 385 individual bodies to appoint 7 members to the oversight boards. July 6, 2016, we're going to have the ground laid to be able to start moving towards finalization, and we think this is a big step in that direction.
I mean, I realize it's perhaps a workload issue for Department of Finance, and I would certainly.
It's really not. I mean, it's not a workload issue. We're still going to be looking at the same number of recognized obligation payment schedules. This is really just to sort of clear the decks at the local level.
Well, I guess what I'd suggest is if it's not a workload issue by the Department of Finance and it's a significant issue for the people at the local level, then maybe you need to, maybe I would ask that you take a look at it to see if it's really a necessary change, if folks at the local level would prefer to deal with local oversight boards as opposed to having the county do it, or the counties are concerned about having to do it, then maybe we ought to think about leaving the process the way it is. So those are my comments. Senator Pan, any questions or comments?
So actually, City of Sacramento mentioned something about using the RDA, having properties and being able to do maintenance on that. Can you address that?
Certainly. Right now, you can create an enforceable obligation to do maintenance on property that the successor agency inherited from the redevelopment agency. And that includes, and we did clarify by striking the reference, that includes removal of graffiti. But what you cannot do is you cannot demolish property, you cannot renovate property outside the scope of an enforceable obligation. And some cities apparently would like to retain the ability to demolish former RDA property under the aegis of that being maintenance of the property. Or they would like to be able to create an enforceable obligation to dispose of it and or to modify it outside the scope of enforceable obligation. We don't believe that should be allowable.
Have you had conversations with the City of Sacramento?
We've had
specifically about
numerous
this?
discussions with the City of Sacramento on a host of issues, and we try to be very accommodating to them.
Okay. I'd like to learn more about those details, perhaps.
Certainly.
So the staff recommendation on this particular item is to approve placeholder trailer bill language. And given these ongoing issues in the discussion today, and I'll go into that in a second, direct staff to continue to work on and refine this language. And that would include, from my perspective, perhaps considering providing that the Glendale versus Department of Finance decision be determinative with respect to the final decision, be determinative with respect to the interest rate to be applied to these loans. 2, that finance continue to work on this reimbursement agreement versus loan issue. And it seems to me that if we have promissory notes that would otherwise be valid and enforceable under the rules in play, that we consider whether, in fact, those should continue to be enforceable and repayment provided for. And then on, as I mentioned, on the countywide oversight board issue, to the extent that it's not a workload issue for the state, which would impact general fund and budgets, that we consider, you consider the input received today from the local agencies, including at least one county, if not more than one, that apparently customers would prefer to have the local oversight boards as we're winding up this redevelopment agency process. So that's the staff recommendation. Do I hear a motion?
So moved.
It's been moved. Call the roll.
Senator Roth.
Aye.
Senator Nguyen. Senator Pan.
Aye. Okay, let's take a 10-minute break. We'll come back and tackle the earned income tax credit proposal on agenda item A. We're going to take up the last item on Agenda Part A, which is item 7730, Franchise Tax Board, Issue 1, Earned Income Tax Credit. Any takers?